They did not kill him quickly. The executioners made sure of that. In a barren courtyard under a gray afternoon sky, Spanish soldiers pinned a Dutch rebel to the wooden scaffold. His wrists and ankles were bound so tightly he couldn't even wipe the cold sweat from his eyes. A heavy iron pot was lowered onto his bare abdomen. Inside it, something alive scratched and squealed. When the brazier was lit on top of the pot, a new kind of horror began. The man's muffled cries turned to shrieks as starving rats, driven by heat and hunger, began to gnaw their way into his stomach. Around the scaffold, onlookers cringed and clutched their mouths, but the soldiers of the Duke of Alba did not flinch. This was exactly the message they wanted to send. This was the fate of Peter, a simple tradesman turned rebel in the Dutch Revolt. He wasn't a lord or a famous general, just one of the many who dared to defy the Spanish crown. Yet his death and agony was staged as a public spectacle, meant to burn itself into the memories of all who saw it. Under the reign of the Duke of Alba, 1567 to 1573, such cruelty was no accident. It was policy. Peter's gruesome end was intended to be a lesson to anyone dreaming of rebellion, and as we'll see, it was one of the darkest chapters in a war already filled with nightmare scenes. What led to this horrific moment, and why would men resort to such monstrosity? To understand that, we must step back to the beginning of Alba's terror and the desperate rebellion of the Dutch. In the 1560s, the Low Countries, today's Netherlands and Belgium, were in turmoil. A growing number of Dutch citizens had embraced Protestant ideas, especially Calvinism, in defiance of their Catholic Spanish king, Philip II. Tensions hit a breaking point in 1566, when bands of Protestants rampaged through churches, smashing Catholic icons in an outburst called the Iconoclastic Fury. The Spanish authorities were furious and alarmed. Philip II decided to make an example of the Netherlands. He would stamp out heresy and rebellion with an iron fist. For this task, he sent Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the third Duke of Alba, to take control. The Duke of Alba arrived in 1567 with an army of Spanish tercios and immediately established a special tribunal to punish anyone suspected of disloyalty or Protestant faith. This court, officially called the Council of Troubles, soon earned a more sinister nickname, the Council of Blood. Its proceedings were swift and merciless. In just a few years, the council condemned thousands of people to death for treason or heresy. About 1,000 were actually executed, by hanging, beheading, burning, or worse. And many more were flogged or imprisoned. Others fled into exile to escape death. Alba's regime confiscated the property of the condemned, and even arrested officials who protested his brutal measures. It truly was a reign of terror. The Duke's methods were not only judicial, he used the Spanish army to terrorize the population. When some towns dared to resist his authority, Alba's forces slaughtered inhabitants as a warning to others. The names of those towns would be seared into Dutch memory: Zutphen, Mechelen, Naarden. Each suffered a bloody Spanish fury. In Zutphen, Spanish troops hunted down rebels and citizens alike, executing hundreds, dumping some bodies in the river. At Naarden, after the town surrendered, the Spanish gathered the townsfolk in a church under pretense of peace, then butchered nearly everyone inside and burned the town. Smoke and screams drifted over the marshes, as only a handful of survivors stumbled away to tell the tale. These atrocities sent a clear message from the Duke of Alba. This is the price of rebellion. It wasn't only commoners who suffered. Alba infamously executed two revered noblemen, the Counts of Egmont and Hoorn, in Brussels in 1568 for supporting the resistance. Their public beheadings shocked Europe. These were men of high birth and loyal service, now bloodily dispatched in the Grand Square before a hushed crowd. That act turned many previously loyal subjects against Spain. It also eliminated moderates who might have brokered peace. The net was cast wide. Anyone, high or low, who opposed King Philip's rule or clung to Protestant faith was in danger. The Dutch people began to view Alba as a cruel tyrant, a boogeyman who drank the blood of the innocents in their land. Mothers frightened unruly children by whispering, "Hush now, or the Duke of Alba will come for you." Against this backdrop, William of Orange, also known as William the Silent, emerged as the figurehead of Dutch resistance. Once a loyal stadtholder for the king, William had broken with Philip II over the persecution of Protestants. He fled abroad just ahead of Alba's arrival, a lucky escape as Alba surely would have executed him. From exile, William raised armies and encouraged the Dutch to resist. His rebel followers, nicknamed the Beggars, struck back at Spanish rule. In April 1572, rebel privateers seized the port of Brielle, a victory that electrified the Netherlands. Town after town in the provinces of Holland and Zeeland rose up and declared for Orange. The flames of revolt were lit. Alba, enraged and determined to snuff out this uprising, struck back ferociously. Spanish columns marched to retake rebel-held towns, and reprisals were brutal. This is the world in which our doomed rebel, Peter, found himself. Alba intended to terrorize the Dutch into submission by any means necessary, and torture was one of his weapons. Indeed, stories spread of captives being broken on the wheel, stretched on the rack, or having their tongues and hands cut off as punishment for defiance. In some cases, the goal was to extract information about rebel plans. In others, pure public intimidation. It was said that Duke Alba himself boasted of executing 18,000 people during his tenure. An exaggeration, perhaps, but it captured the nightmarish reputation of his rule. Under this shadow of fear, every Dutch rebel knew that capture meant a fate worse than death. Yet the cruelty was not one-sided. This bitter conflict pushed some of the Dutch rebels to answer atrocity with atrocity. Rebel warlords, too, sometimes used grisly tortures on their Spanish enemies or suspected collaborators. For instance, one of William of Orange's own commanders, Diedrich Sonoy, was rumored to torture captured Catholic loyalists by the same terrible method we witnessed at the start. He would trap rats on a prisoner's belly under a bowl and heat it, forcing the frantic creatures to gnaw into the victim's bowels to escape. In a war fueled by religious hatred and revenge, mercy was in short supply. This was the world of horror that Peter stepped into when he joined the rebellion. A world where being caught by the enemy could unleash human imagination at its worst. Who was Peter, and what did he do to deserve such a gruesome end? Peter was an ordinary man swept up in extraordinary times. A blacksmith by trade from a small town in Holland, he had lived quietly until the war reached his doorstep. In early 1572, inspired by William of Orange's call to resist tyranny, Peter helped form a local band of rebels. They swore to fight for their faith. He had secretly become a Protestant, and for the ancient rights of their town against the Spanish oppressor. Peter wasn't a notorious outlaw or a great military leader. He was simply a father and a husband who had had enough of living in fear. His acts of rebellion started small. He and his compatriots would sabotage Spanish supplies, ferry messages between rebel cities, and hide wanted dissenters from Alba's soldiers. Peter became particularly good at smuggling letters. He carried communications from William of Orange's agents, moving under cover of night from one safe house to another, through marshes and woods. Each time he slipped past a Spanish patrol, his confidence grew. In those secret letters, he read words of hope. William promised relief, foreign support, and freedom of religion once the Spanish were driven out. Peter dared to dream that his children might see that day. But Alba's spies were everywhere. One fateful evening, Peter's luck ran out. Betrayal struck. A fellow townsman, perhaps under torture or hoping for a reward, revealed Peter's identity as a rebel courier. As Peter returned to his village with letters concealed in his boot soles, Spanish soldiers were waiting in the dark. He had barely stepped through his own doorway when boots thudded on the threshold. They came for him, torches, drawn swords, and the red and yellow uniforms of the hated Spanish tercios. Peter's wife screamed as they seized him, and his children clung to his legs until soldiers pried them off. The commander dumped out Peter's boots and found the hidden letters, sealed with William of Orange's emblem. This was enough to seal Peter's fate. He was dragged in chains to the nearest fortress, a stronghold flying the banner of the Duke of Alba. There, Peter was thrown into a cold dungeon, accused of treason and heresy. His captors mocked him as he shivered in the dark. "You wanted William's freedom? You'll die William's death instead." Within a day, He was brought before the Council of Blood, or rather, a traveling tribunal of Alba's officers and inquisitors. The trial was perfunctory. Peter was not a nobleman with any chance of mercy. He was just one of countless common folk condemned in batches. There was no advocate to defend him. A clerk read out the charges: rebellion against His Majesty, blasphemy and heresy for forsaking the Catholic faith, and assisting the enemy, William of Orange. Peter tried to speak, perhaps to plead for his family's safety if not his own, but a guard struck him in the stomach with a pike end, silencing him with a gasp of pain. The judges needed no further evidence. The letters he carried were proof enough, and Peter himself was a known agitator in his village. The verdict? Death. That was a foregone conclusion. But the manner of death? That was something carefully chosen. In most cases, captured rebels might be swiftly executed by hanging or firing squad. But Alba's regime had started to realize that simple executions were not stemming the tide of unrest. The rebellion still raged on, fueled by outrage at Spanish brutality. To truly cow the people, Alba thought, he needed to make examples that would haunt the mind. So for Peter, the authorities devised a special punishment, one meant to be spoken of in terrified whispers across the Netherlands. They would turn nature itself into an instrument of terror. As Peter awaited his sentence in the dungeon, he heard the screams of others echoing in the halls. Some prisoners were being tortured for information. The crack of bones on the rack or the sizzle of hot irons on flesh provided a ghastly soundtrack to his last night alive. Perhaps an interrogator even visited Peter, showing him the devices in the torchlight and asking if he had any last secrets to confess. Peter had none to give that they didn't already know. In truth, his execution wasn't about extracting intelligence. It was about sending a message of dread. Before dawn, his sentence was announced to the town. The rebel Peter would die that very day, and all citizens were required to attend. A forced audience gathered to witness what happens to those who defy the king. Mothers, fathers, and children were driven at pike point into the square of the fortress courtyard. The atmosphere was tense and terrified. Spanish soldiers formed a ring of steel around the edges to ensure no one left early, and perhaps to prevent any rescue attempt. Some of Peter's neighbors and family were in the crowd, including, heartbreakingly, his wife Johanna. She had been kept alive only to watch the brutal fate of her husband, so that her despair might echo through the community. The cruelty was calculated at every level. They tied Peter down tightly and placed the iron pot on his bare abdomen, trapping a terrified animal beneath it. The soldiers heated the pot until panic set into the creature. Peter felt it scramble and claw at his skin. He screamed and thrashed against his bonds, but the ropes held. The rat, driven by heat and fear, attacked his exposed flesh in a frantic attempt to escape. The courtyard echoed with a raw, human scream, a sound that made many in the crowd turn away and made others stare in horrified fascination. When the pot was finally lifted, the sight of Peter, grievously wounded and barely conscious, was enough to silence the square. He died soon after. His life ended in a way that would be whispered about for years. That terrible spectacle was not finished. A second captured rebel, forced forward as a warning, was subjected to the same ordeal. Forewarned and broken by fear, the young man's mind unraveled under the knowledge of what awaited him. His pleas and prayers could not save him. When he too was exposed to the method, the same contraption, the same fatal outcome, the crowd recoiled. The magistrate watched with grim satisfaction. The message had been sent. The two men were removed, declared traitors, and the town was ordered to remember. In the immediate aftermath, stunned silence fell over the square. Some walked away pale and trembling, unable to speak. Others clung to family members and hurried home, burning any incriminating papers they owned. The Spanish officers believed the demonstration had worked. For a time, open rebellion in that area dropped. The spectacle had sown terror into hearts and homes. But terror had a double edge. As word spread beyond the fortress walls, the story of Peter's end hardened many who heard it. Pamphlets and engravings, some crude, some skillfully drawn, began to circulate. They portrayed the executions as proof of the Spanish crown's monstrous cruelty. Instead of cowing everyone into submission, the grisly tale united people across different towns and creeds in outrage. Moderates who might have sought compromise found themselves repelled by the brutality. William of Orange's cause gained new moral force as men and women compared their suffering to the savagery they had witnessed. Over the months that followed, Alba's severity proved a strategic mistake. His reign of terror cost him allies and stirred a deeper, more determined resistance. Places that might once have surrendered fought on, preferring to resist, flood their fields, or hold out through famine rather than accept the Duke's terms. Alba grew frustrated and isolated. By late 1573, he was recalled to Spain, his reputation as a merciless enforcer secured, his policies blamed for inflaming rather than calming the revolt. Peter's name, whether whispered as a warning or invoked as a martyr, lingered in local memory. His death became part of the story the Dutch told about themselves, a story of suffering, endurance, and the choice to keep resisting. What was intended as a demonstration of power helped articulate a moral case for independence. The revolt would span decades, shaped by battles, sieges, and sacrifices such as Peter's. In the end, the Dutch struggle produced an independent nation, but not without leaving deep scars. History asks uncomfortable questions. Peter's story forces us to confront the cost of tyrannies that trade justice for spectacle. It also prompts another, harsher question. How far will people go when they believe all other options are closed? Sometimes the answer is bravery. Sometimes it is bloody revenge. For the people of the Low Countries, the cruelty they endured steeled their determination to fight for a different future. Thank you for staying with this difficult story. If this moved you, consider how such moments from the past shape present ideas about justice and resistance. Leave your thoughts below. What would you have done in a time like that? Hit subscribe for more history from the darker corners of the past, and we'll see you next